Imagine a land where generations of families had lived for centuries, where their traditions were woven into the very fabric of the rivers, forests, and mountains. Now, picture an invisible storm gathering on the horizon, a storm that would forever alter their lives. This was the reality for indigenous tribes in the southeastern United States during the early 19th century. While the young nation celebrated progress and expansion, a hidden drama was unfolding on the American frontier. Policies were being forged in the halls of power that threatened the very existence of entire peoples. This era, often just a footnote in history books, set the stage for one of the most heartbreaking chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears, a story of forced displacement and profound sorrow. As settlers, driven by dreams of land and prosperity, pushed relentlessly westward, the ancestral homelands promised to native communities became the new prize. A series of government actions and treaties began to methodically strip indigenous peoples of their territories. The storm wasn't sudden. It gathered silently, insidiously, with each broken promise and each newly drawn map line. The consequences, however, would be devastating, echoing through generations and shaping the nation in ways we are still grappling with today. The roots of this tragedy run deep, back to the policies enacted in the early 1800s. The political climate shifted dramatically with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1829. Jackson's vision for the United States was one of aggressive, relentless expansion. He championed the idea that the lands inhabited by Native Americans were obstacles to progress, lands that could better serve the growing nation's insatiable appetite for farming, new settlements, and resource extraction. This ideology, often called Manifest Destiny, cast a long shadow over the tribes of the Southeast. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, known as the Five Civilized Tribes, faced immense pressure from both the federal government and individual states like Georgia. Land-hungry settlers, eyeing the fertile soil perfect for cotton cultivation, lobbied politicians and stoked public resentment. To legitimize the process, treaties were signed. On paper, they often promised protection, financial compensation, or new lands in the West. But in reality, these negotiations were frequently conducted under extreme duress. Tribal leaders were subjected to coercion, manipulation, and outright deception, leaving them with little real choice in deciding the fate of their people and their ancestral lands. These legal documents were not agreements between equals. They were instruments of dispossession. The situation reached a boiling point in the 1830s. The turning point was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Jackson. This legislation gave the federal government the authority to forcibly relocate native tribes from their homelands in the Southeast to designated territory west of the Mississippi River, primarily in what is now Oklahoma. This act wasn't just about moving people from one place to another. It was a systematic, institutionalized process that completely disregarded the sovereignty, the rich cultures, and the fundamental human rights of tens of thousands of individuals. It declared that their deep connection to the land, a connection that spanned millennia, was less important than the ambitions of the expanding United States. Tribal leaders did not stand by passively. They fought back with every tool they had. They engaged in fierce political debates, sent delegations to Washington, and even turned to the American legal system for justice. In a landmark case, Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court actually sided with the Cherokee Nation, affirming their sovereignty. But President Jackson famously defied the court's ruling. This defiance sent a chilling message. The rule of law would not protect them. The full, inexorable force of the federal government was aligned against them. The narrative of removal was framed as a benevolent act of progress, a way to protect indigenous people from the corrupting influence of white society. But for the people who would be forced to leave everything behind, it was the beginning of a profound and devastating rupture from their homes, their sacred sites, and centuries of heritage. To truly understand this period, we have to look beyond the laws and the politics and focus on the human experience. Imagine the terror and uncertainty that swept through entire communities. Families were given notice that they had to abandon the homes their ancestors had built. They had to leave behind fields full of crops, the livestock they had carefully raised, and most painfully, the sacred burial grounds where their loved ones were laid to rest. They were herded into stockades and encampments, waiting for the forced march to begin. The journey westward, which hadn't even started for many, was already a source of immense dread. It was a journey into the unknown, a path across unfamiliar and harsh terrains. Disease, exposure to the elements, and starvation were not just possibilities, they were near certainties. The psychological toll was immense. Anxiety and despair hung heavy in the air as people grappled with a reality they could barely comprehend. Leaders and elders bore the crushing weight of guiding their people through this unprecedented crisis, making impossible decisions that could mean the difference between survival and death. The suspense of this era wasn't just in the political battles. It was in the silent, agonizing wait. It was the knowledge that an unavoidable, tragic path had been laid out before them, and that their destinies were about to unfold in ways that would leave a permanent scar on the soul of a nation. This wasn't just a policy debate. It was a human catastrophe in the making. Every family had a story. Every individual faced the loss of their world. The silent dread in the villages and the worried whispers around the campfires were the prelude to the devastating march that would come to be known as the Trail of Tears. Understanding this lead-up is crucial, because it shows that this tragedy was not an accident of history. It was the result of deliberate choices, of policies built on greed and prejudice. It was a storm that had been gathering for decades, and its impact would be felt for centuries to come. The moment of departure came with a quiet, heavy intensity, the kind that feels inevitable. Imagine your home, the place where generations of your family have lived, laughed, and celebrated. Now, imagine it falling silent. Villages that once pulsed with music, ceremony, and the sounds of community life became hushed as families packed what little they could carry. Elders, with tears in their eyes, offered blessings and whispered prayers for guidance, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. Across the rolling hills and through the dense forests of the American Southeast, word of the coming removal spread like a shadow. The air grew thick with tension. For the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, this wasn't just about moving. It was a confrontation with an unstoppable force, a heartbreaking realization that no legal argument, no treaty, and no heartfelt plea could halt the relentless machinery of expansion. Some clung to a fragile hope that negotiation or diplomacy might yet save them from displacement. But the constant pressure from soldiers, federal agents, and the demands of settlers left them with no choice but to prepare for a journey they never wanted to take, a journey west, away from everything they had ever known. The logistics of this forced migration were staggering and tragically underestimated by those who planned it. Thousands of people, men, women, and children, were herded into temporary camps, often under the most brutal conditions. Picture crowded stockades with minimal provisions, where families were left exposed to the elements. Supplies of food, medicine, and adequate shelter were almost non-existent. The weather showed no mercy. As these caravans of families began their long, slow trek, the sheer reality of the distance and the unforgiving terrain hit them with full force. There were wide, rushing rivers to cross, dense, trackless forests to navigate, and vast, open plains to endure. All of this had to be done while trying to care for the very young, the elderly, and the sick. This path westward was more than just a physical journey. It was an emotional and spiritual ordeal. Every single step was a painful symbol of a permanent separation from the lands that had nurtured their ancestors for time immemorial. The crushing weight of grief and the gnawing uncertainty of the future pressed down on every single traveler, making each mile feel like a lifetime. Despite these unimaginable hardships, the indigenous communities showed a resilience and unity that is nothing short of remarkable. Leaders emerged, organizing the long, sorrowful marches, doing everything they could to ensure the most vulnerable members of their communities were supported. They kept the memory of their ancestral lands alive through the oral tradition of stories, through sacred songs, and through ancient rituals performed on foreign soil. These cultural touchstones became a lifeline, a way to hold on to their identity in the face of erasure. Yet the challenges were relentless and unforgiving. Disease, malnutrition, and sheer exhaustion claimed countless lives along the way, leaving deep, permanent scars on the survivors. The federal government, which tried to frame the removal as an orderly and humane process, consistently failed to provide the adequate assistance it had promised. The level of support, or lack thereof, often depended on the whims of local authorities. This journey became a brutal test, not just of physical endurance, but of the human spirit itself, as families confronted despair, profound loss, and the terrifying uncertainty of what awaited them in the new unfamiliar territories, assigned to them by the very government that had taken their homes. As the weeks dragged into months, the caravan of exiles pressed onward. The land itself often seemed to mirror the bleak emotional landscape of the travelers. They faced harsh, biting winters that froze them to the bone, torrential rains that turned the paths to mud, and sweltering summers that baked the earth and drained their strength. These environmental pressures pushed them to the absolute limits of human endurance. Alongside these physical trials, the anticipation of finally reaching the so-called Indian territory brought a strange, complicated tension. It was a mixture of hope and fear, relief and apprehension. Would they be able to rebuild? Would they ever feel at home again? Throughout this ordeal, the elders played a crucial role. They tried to guide the children through the hardship, sharing the history of their people, telling them stories of their ancestors' strength, and reinforcing the promise that their culture, their language, and their spirit would survive, no matter what. This delicate, painful balance between utter despair and unwavering determination came to define the essence of what is now known as the Trail of Tears. It marks a dark chapter in history, a time when the incredible strength of human resilience was tested against the harshest of trials, and where the shadow of that loss still stretches long across the continent. After months of grueling travel, the weary survivors of the forced removal finally laid eyes on the lands designated as their new homes, far beyond the Mississippi River. This wasn't the familiar embrace of dense forests, winding rivers, and ancient mountains they had always known. Instead, a vast foreign landscape stretched before them, raw and unfamiliar. A wave of relief at the end of the journey was quickly met with a sobering apprehension. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was to be their permanent reality. As families took their first steps onto this strange soil, a complex mix of awe and deep sorrow filled the air. The elders, the keepers of tradition, felt the spiritual and cultural void most acutely. Their ancestral grounds, the very source of their identity and connection to the sacred, were gone. The physical journey might have been over, but the far greater challenge of rebuilding an entire world in an alien environment was just beginning. This new chapter would test the endurance, ingenuity, and very fabric of each community in ways they had never imagined. Settling into these new areas was a slow and painful process. The initial shelters were often nothing more than rudimentary structures, hastily built to fend off the elements. Resources were scarce, a stark contrast to the abundance of their homelands. The land itself was a puzzle. The climate was different, the soil resisted familiar crops, and the entire ecosystem was alien. The corn, beans, and squash that had flourished for generations now struggled to take root. Hunting and fishing traditions, honed over centuries, had to be completely relearned to sustain their families. Yet, even in the face of this immense struggle, The people drew from their deepest wellspring, centuries of accumulated knowledge. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was a lifeline, a way to transmit history, values, and survival techniques. Rituals and ceremonies, though performed in a new setting, anchored their identity and reaffirmed their connection to the Creator. Communal work became more important than ever, binding families together as they faced the monumental task of building a new life from scratch. These fledgling settlements, born of tragedy, became crucibles for cultural preservation, where ancient traditions and poignant memories intertwined to forge a path of continuity against the backdrop of profound dislocation. Life in these new territories was a constant struggle, made even more difficult by the ongoing pressures from federal and state authorities. The relocation was declared complete, but the promises of assistance, supplies, and protection were rarely fulfilled. Aid was inconsistent, often arriving late or not at all. This neglect left communities vulnerable. New conflicts arose with settlers over land boundaries, and bureaucratic red tape created endless delays and frustrations, adding another heavy layer of stress to people already exhausted by loss and fatigue. But these external pressures had an unintended effect. They forged an even stronger sense of unity within the tribes. With no one else to rely on, families turned inward, depending on one another for everything from a shared meal to emotional support. A powerful network of mutual reliance became their primary survival tool. Elders stepped into their roles as pillars of the community, their wisdom and stories offering not just practical guidance, but also a beacon of hope in dark times. Children, watching and listening, absorbed profound lessons in resilience and perseverance. Meanwhile, tribal leaders had to walk a precarious tightrope, engaging in delicate negotiations with government agents while fiercely protecting the cultural values and integrity of their people. It was a period defined by quiet endurance, daily adaptation, and a defiant spirit that refused to be extinguished by circumstances seemingly beyond their control. Despite the crushing reality of their situation, moments of renewal began to emerge like green shoots through scorched earth. In quiet clearings and humble dwellings, the sounds of ceremony and song could be heard once more. These acts were not grand displays, but intimate, powerful reaffirmations of their identity. The sacred art of storytelling flourished, weaving threads of continuity that connected the past to the present, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancestors would not be lost. Communities slowly found their footing. They experimented with new farming techniques, adapting their agricultural knowledge to the unfamiliar soil. They established schools, determined to equip their children with the tools needed to navigate this new world. Brick by brick, seed by seed, they began to build the foundations for future generations. Still, the shadow of the Trail of Tears was ever present. It was a silent, persistent reminder of the brutal journey, the lost loved ones, and the sacred homelands left behind. Every memory of home was tinged with the weight of what was stolen, a sorrow that lived alongside their determination to survive. This period of adaptation was not a story of surrender. It was a testament to incredible resilience. In the face of unimaginable loss, Indigenous peoples forged a new path forward, carrying the heavy legacy of displacement while planting the seeds of survival, identity, and enduring hope for the generations yet to come. Even after the forced marshes ended, the story of the Trail of Tears was far from over. For generations, its echoes would reverberate, shaping the history, the culture, and the very identity of the Native American communities who survived. The physical displacement was complete, but the emotional and cultural wounds remained, passed down in stories told around the fire, in solemn songs, and through powerful art. The communities that endured this unimaginable ordeal carried more than just memories of loss. They carried with them profound lessons of survival, of sticking together, and of a resilience that refused to be broken. The new lands they were assigned were a complicated reality. On one hand, they were a place to rebuild, to start anew. On the other, they were a constant, painful symbol of the injustice they had suffered. This duality became a foundation for future generations, a reminder of the immense challenges their ancestors had overcome and the strength they had shown in the face of it all. The memory wasn't just about pain. It was about the will to continue. Meanwhile, the broader American society was slow to grasp the true depth of what had happened. For many years, understanding of the forced removals was limited, often sanitized or simply ignored. Government policies toward Native peoples swung back and forth, from neglect and indifference to aggressive assimilation efforts, with only rare moments of genuine support. But through all of this, the legacy of the Trail of Tears stood as a stark and undeniable testament to the human cost of unchecked expansionist ambition. It was a dark chapter that couldn't be completely erased from the national story, no matter how hard some tried. Despite the displacement and the immense pressure to assimilate, indigenous peoples held on. They fought to maintain their languages, their sacred traditions, and their own systems of governance. They proved, with incredible strength, that a culture and an identity cannot be wiped out simply by forcing people from their homes or trying to coerce them into forgetting who they are. This period of rebuilding, even in exile, showcased the unbreakable spirit of communities who carefully nurtured their heritage, ensuring that the history of their removal would not be a forgotten footnote, but a living, breathing part of their collective memory. When we reflect on the Trail of Tears, it's as crucial to see it for what it was, not just a logistical problem or a political maneuver, but a profound human tragedy. It starkly revealed the deep and often brutal tension between power and justice, between the drive for expansion and the capacity for empathy. Think about it. Entire nations of people faced forced migration, the theft of their ancestral lands, and the constant threat to their very identity in unfamiliar territories. Yet, their story is not just one of suffering. Their endurance offers us powerful lessons in perseverance, the importance of community, and the quiet dignity of the human spirit. The moral weight of this history isn't just in acknowledging the immense pain that was inflicted. It's also in honoring the incredible courage and sheer determination of those who survived. They took a legacy of trauma and transformed it into a powerful narrative of strength and continuity, refusing to let their story end in defeat. This transformation is, in itself, a testament to their incredible spirit and a lesson for all of us. Today, the legacy of the Trail of Tears continues to be incredibly relevant. It shapes ongoing conversations about justice, historical memory, and the vital importance of cultural preservation. Across the country, monuments, museums, and annual commemorations serve as powerful reminders of the real human cost of expansion and displacement. They ensure that the world does not forget. At the same time, Native communities actively honor the resilience of their ancestors through education, through vibrant storytelling, and through a powerful revival of their cultures and languages. The story of the Trail of Tears, therefore, is not a closed chapter. It's not a story about finality or defeat. It's a story of endurance, of reflection, and of a spirit that could not be extinguished. It urges every single one of us who learns about it to think deeply about the consequences of policy, of unchecked ambition, and of simple indifference. The story concludes not with despair, but with a clear moral imperative for all of us: to remember the past, to respect the people and cultures who endured, and to ensure that the hard-won lessons of history guide our future toward a world built on justice, empathy, and the unwavering protection of human dignity. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.